As we've been looking at fluid and electrolyte balance, we saw that there are various ions that play different roles in helping to maintain homeostasis. One of the major homeostatic challenges related to ions is keeping the hydrogen ion concentration of body fluids at an appropriate level. Now remember, pH is a measure of hydrogen ions in a solution. So this task is called the maintenance of the acid-base balance, and it's critical for normal cellular function. For instance, the three-dimensional shape of proteins, the way they fold, and the chemical bonds that form are very sensitive to pH changes. When you have a diet that consists of a large amount of proteins, cellular metabolism produces more acids than bases, and that tends to make the blood more acidic. In a healthy person, we have several mechanisms that help to maintain the pH range of blood between 7.35 and 7.45. Because metabolic reactions can produce a huge amount of hydrogen ions, the lack of a mechanism to get rid of those hydrogen ions would cause them to accumulate in body fluids and change pH to what could be a lethal acidic level. Homeostasis of hydrogen ion concentration within that narrow range is essential to the survival of the human body. The removal of hydrogen ions from body fluids depends on three major mechanisms. Buffers act to temporarily bind to hydrogen ions and remove them from solution. So buffers raise the pH of body fluids, but they don't remove the hydrogen ions from the body. They simply bind to those hydrogen ions in body fluids. Increasing the rate and depth that you breathe, more carbon dioxide can then be exhaled. Within just a few minutes, this reduces the level of CO2 in the blood. That means we create less carbonic acid when that CO2 binds to the water in the blood. By reducing the amount of carbonic acid, then we reduce the level of hydrogen ions in the blood, and that raises pH. The slowest mechanism, though, is the only way that we can actually eliminate those hydrogen ions from the body fluids, and that is through their excretion in urine. Most buffer systems in the body are made up of a weak acid and the salt of that acid, which function as a weak base. Buffers prevent rapid and drastic changes in pH of body fluids by converting strong acids and bases to weak acids and bases, and this can happen within just fractions of a second. Strong acids lower pH more than weak acids because strong acids release hydrogen ions more readily. Same way, strong bases raise pH more than weak bases. So one of the buffer systems that the body uses is called a protein buffer system, and it's the most abundant buffer in the intracellular fluid and blood plasma. Proteins are composed of amino acids that contain a carboxyl group, that's that COOH group, and an amino group, that NH2. So carboxyl groups act like an acid by releasing hydrogen ions when pH rises. The amino group can act as a base by combining with hydrogen ions when pH falls. So proteins can buffer both acids and bases. The carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system is based on the bicarbonate ion, that's the HCO3, which can act as a weak base, and the carbonic acid, the H2CO3, which can act as a weak acid. I'm sorry if I said bicarbonate could act as an acid. The bicarbonate ion acts as a weak base. The carbonic acid works as a weak acid. So if there's an excess of hydrogen ions, the bicarbonate ions can function as a weak base and remove the hydrogen ions. So the bicarbonate binds to the hydrogen ions, creates the weak acid, carbonic acid. Then the carbonic acid can dissociate into water and CO2. So if you break this down, it releases H2O and CO2. The CO2 then we exhale from the lungs. On the other hand, if there's a shortage of hydrogen ions, the carbonic acid can function as a weak acid and provide hydrogen ions. Okay, so your carbonic acid can dissociate. We simply reverse the equation to release bicarbs and hydrogen ions. Thus, this system, the carbonic acid and bicarbonate, helps to balance pH by driving that equation in the direction that we need to either create more bicarbs or create more carbonic acid to prevent those rapid and drastic fluctuations in pH. Alright, the phosphate buffer system acts pretty similar to the mechanism that we just saw for the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system. So the phosphate ions can act as a weak acid and buffer strong bases by forming chemical bonds, and when they do so, they create water and a weak base rather than that strong base. This reaction is one of the ways that the kidneys also help to maintain the pH by excreting these hydrogen ions in the urine. So what's the big picture with these buffer systems? Strong acids and bases can bind to each other, hydrogen ions, phosphate ions, bicarb ions, and convert strong acids and bases to weak acids and bases. That's the big picture with these buffer systems. Going hand in hand with that carbonic acid bicarb buffer system, let's just think about the act of breathing. It plays an important role in maintaining the pH of body fluids. An increase in CO2 concentration in body fluids increases hydrogen ion concentration and lowers the pH, making body fluids more acidic. If you don't believe me, pause for a moment. Hold your breath. When you stop holding your breath, you're going to exhale. The reason for that is your lungs are helping you to get rid of that buildup of CO2. Because when CO2 bonds to water in the blood, it creates carbonic acid. Carbonic acid can then dissociate to release hydrogen ions, acid, and bicarbonate ions, which are alkaline. So you created or retained more CO2. So your respiratory center caused you to release it when you had to let go. Now, on the other hand, a decrease in CO2 in your body fluids raises your pH and makes the fluids more alkaline. So changes in the rate and depth of breathing can alter the pH of body fluids within a couple of minutes. With increased ventilation, more CO2 is released. Hydrogen ion concentration falls and blood pH increases. If ventilation is slower than normal, less CO2 is exhaled, CO2 levels rise, hydrogen ion concentration increases, and blood pH decreases. So the pH of body fluids and the rate and depth of breathing interact in a negative feedback manner as illustrated here in the image on the next slide. Let me get that one up there for you. Alright, so when the blood acidity increases, the decrease in pH, which means there's more hydrogen ions, is detected by your chemoreceptors in the medulla oblongata and in the aortic arch and the carotid arteries. This stimulates your respiratory group in the medulla oblongata. The diaphragm and the other respiratory muscles are going to contract more forcefully and more frequently so that you exhale more, get rid of more CO2. As less carbonic acid forms, there's fewer hydrogen ions present. Blood pH increases. When the response brings your blood pH back to normal, then there's a return to acid-base balance. Metabolic reactions create a lot of acids, a huge amount of acids, and the only way to get rid of all of those hydrogen ions in that huge amount is to excrete them in the urine. So the proximal convoluted tubules and the collecting ducts of the kidneys secrete hydrogen ions into the tubular fluid. Because these ions can't diffuse back into the tubular cells, then they're excreted in the urine. And this is just a summary slide of the mechanisms that help maintain pH of body fluids. Remember, buffer systems are going to consist of a weak acid and its salt, which functions as a weak base, and these together can prevent those drastic changes in body fluid pH. You saw the protein buffer system and the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system and the phosphate buffer systems. In addition to that, we have the physical buffer systems, such as altering the rate that we get rid of or retain CO2, which is going to be directly tied to the creation of carbonic acid and the release of those hydrogen ions. So the more CO2 we retain in the body, the more acidic body fluids become. And then the second physical buffer system that we looked at just briefly was the kidneys and their role in excreting hydrogen ions into the urine, but also in addition to that, they have the ability to retain bicarbonate ions so that they're not lost in the urine. All of these systems together help to regulate pH of body fluids.